to the What Really Happened radio show. The history of the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Thursday, September 19th, 2013. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. And I want to start off for people listening over the Internet to our show or watching over BAM User TV. The show may be a little bit glitchy today. Apparently, Apple just released iOS 7. And the surge of people downloading and updating their iPad and iTablet and iThis and iThat has really resulted in a huge traffic jam for the Internet. And I just heard from the control room that they actually lost my signal here for just a second. So it's just the state of the infrastructure, and the release of iOS 7 apparently has boosted Internet traffic something like 130%. Of what it would normally be, and so we're seeing some glitches happening there. Alrighty, so phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Manny's in our control room, twiddling the dials and answering the phones when you call on in. And starting here right at the top, and I hate to say I told you so, actually that's not true, I rather like it. It does turn out, it has been confirmed, the Navy Yard shooter Aaron Alexis was on prescription antidepressants. He was on trazodone, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, trazodone. And apparently it was prescribed to him for insomnia. Now, it doesn't mean he was not also on other medications. But the side effects reported for trazodone are panic reaction, sudden, overpowering, chaotic, and confused mental state of terror, resulting in being doubt-ridden, often accompanied by hyperventilation and extreme anxiety. Suicidal behaviors are reported with this thing. Will attempt to kill themselves, and agitation, a sudden, violent, and forceful, emotionally disturbed state of mind. And over at ssristories.com, they have several incidents of shootings, stabbings, suicides that are linked to trazodone. So there's your problem. And the point here is, despite all the best efforts of the FBI and everybody else, they cannot find any motive for this guy to have done what he did. And so the focus is on the fact that he was on one of these dangerous prescription medications and apparently just flipped out from it. Now, there was an interesting article that we posted to whatreallyhappened.com talking about the effects of trazodone and the dangers of repeated use and withdrawal. And apparently when you're going on this medication and come off, the more you do it, the more extreme the reactions are likely to be. And it's really a situation here where there really is no other explanation for why this guy did what he did. Now, they're reporting that he took that new shotgun that he had purchased only a week ago, and he had started carving messages into the gun stock, into the wood of the gun stock, and he wrote "better off this way," which certainly sounds like drug-induced suicidal mania, and "my ELF weapon," which nobody's really sure what that means, but obviously we're dealing with somebody who is in a very altered state. So again, it is a confirmed. One of the drugs Aaron Alexis was on was trazodone, which can create panic and extreme, sudden, violent, emotionally disturbed state of mind. And so that's the big question. Was this the only medication he was on? Was he on other medications? We've reprised to our front page, our resource page of all these documentaries and articles about how dangerous these drugs are. And I know that not everybody who takes these medications suffers these adverse effects, but a significant number of them do. Now, when the altered behavior leads to violence and death, it gets recorded and documented. But we also have to look at those incidences where people have an adverse reaction where it's never reported, and I went through one of those myself many years ago when I was going through the breakup of my first marriage, and I was seeing my doctor on a completely unrelated medical matter, and she said, are you dealing with depression from the breakup of your marriage? I said, yeah, it's hard to remain entirely cheerful about that sort of a thing. And she said, here, you need this. And she wrote me a prescription, and I don't remember what she put me on. But I remember for 3 weeks, I felt great. I was fun to be with. I was up. And the 4th week, I had an adverse reaction that just put me into the absolute blackest depression I've ever known, and I got through it simply by saying, it's only the chemical, it's only the chemical, it's only the chemical. And I will never, ever, ever, ever touch those things again. Somebody else sent in a YouTube playlist of 17 documentaries about the dangers of prescription antidepressants. And these things are dangerous for a susceptible segment of our population. 20% of Americans are now on some form of these prescription antidepressants, which means 20% of our police force, which may in fact account for much of the explosion of police brutality we're seeing across this country. And we have that other article coming from a study in Florida saying that police psychologists are prescribing more of these medications to police than the general population. So it's more than 20% of the police are on these medications. We may presume that at least 20% of people in the government, including the White House itself, are on these medications, if not more. It was reported that Obama was dealing with depression in his first term. Is he on these medications? And if he is, should we let him have the keys to the nuclear weapons? Now, all of this stuff is well known. The corporate media doesn't want to tell you about it because they don't want to lose those big, lucrative pharmaceutical commercials that you see pushing the latest wonder drug that will do this, and all the disclaimers at the end, you know, you might actually die from this stuff, and if you do, it's not our fault because we warned you. Congress actually held hearings on this problem. They know it's a problem. It's actually now on the paperwork to register or apply for a gun permit in many states. Are you on prescription antidepressants? And if you check that yes box, you don't get your gun permit. But Congress doesn't want to do anything about it because they are the recipients of very generous campaign contributions by Big Pharma. So if you think about it, protecting the true cause of all this mass violence, the prescription antidepressants, makes the United States government and the corporate media accessories after the fact to all these mass murders because they're protecting the real root cause. It's just easier to blame the guns, or in another case now they're trying to blame video games again. Anything to take the focus off the link between prescription antidepressants and violence. And Big Pharma's PR people are already on overtime all over the net saying, oh, no, it was MK Ultra, it was HARP, it was chemtrails, it was a Manchurian candidate, it was this, it was that. They're desperate to take the focus off the fact that it's now been confirmed that the Washington, D.C. shooter, Aaron Alexis, was on trazodone, and that trazodone has a documented history of triggering completely irrational states of panic and violence. So, let's see. Another little story here, somewhat related. This came out of Natural News, and it's talking about the recent surge in retracted studies on psychiatric medication. And they apparently caught one of these studies switching the before and after data. Because apparently on the study, the patients given the medication actually got worse, and they swapped the numbers to make it look like they'd gotten better. And they're talking about the huge surge of studies that are being retracted, not from honest error, but from detection of outright fraud. And it's all to push these products. And they are not well tested. The U.S. government has completely abandoned making sure that what you buy in your pharmacies and supermarkets is actually safe to use. There used to be a principle in medicine, first of all, do no harm. And that one has just gone away. They sell you a medicine, it's got an adverse side effect. Oh, we've got another medication to take care of that side effect. And what, the second medication made something else happen? Well, we're going to give you a third medication to take care of the side effects from the second medication that you took to take the side effects from the first medication. It's all about the money. We've got to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back here. And I know we've got a bunch of phone calls on this very topic. So, counting down to the music. I misread the clock on this one. There's the music. We'll be right back. Hello, America. Welcome back to the show. And I'm going to slow down my speaking a little bit because we are having communications problems today. There's the overload from Apple iOS 7. And Hawaii has only 3 cable links to the mainland, and one of those is going to a server which is currently offline. So not a very good day on the Internet. All right, we're going to take a couple of phone calls here. Jerry in Chicago. Aloha, Jerry. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Michael. You know, I was catching your archive of yesterday's show because I missed it earlier today. And you mentioned something about Fukushima and Stuxnet. I think it was, that computer virus.
Stuxnet, yes.
Yes, okay. There's a guy by the name of Jim Stone, and I got turned on to this guy about 2 years ago on YouTube, and he lays it all out. He looks at the epicenter of the earthquake and where it happened and everything else like that. I thought it was very interesting how he explains it, he details it, and if you follow along on his website, which I can't do simultaneously while watching it, but if you record it earlier, you could play it back and follow along on his website.
Mm-hmm.
How this was possibly, with the camera system that they had in there to monitor the gauges and everything, and here's what he explained. What happened was that a nuclear reactor simply blew the top off of it that was shut down at least 5 months earlier for maintenance. How does that happen?
Well, I have not heard of this before, but again, the root cause of all of this was, obviously the earthquake and the tsunami meeting inadequate safety precautions. The seawall should have been higher. The emergency generators should have been up on a hill, but we also know that the emergency safety systems that were there in Fukushima did not function as they were supposed to. And they all use these Siemens industrial controllers that are standard all around the globe for these kind of facilities, and they're also the very type of controller that was targeted by Stuxnet. And we know that Stuxnet, after it did what it was supposed to do in Iran, it broke into the wild. It was all across Russia, damaging factories. And we do know Stuxnet was in Japan around Fukushima prior to the quake and tsunami. So I think it's a valid question to ask if the severity of the Fukushima disaster was an unexpected side effect of this covert war against Iran. Okay.
This is where he leads to it and everything else like that. Something else I caught the other night, Stan Dale was on Tuesday night, and he's a professor or whatever, but he was saying they'd be drilled down 2 miles below Fukushima and detonate low-yield nuclear devices and maybe have this whole thing cave in on itself and cause a glass bubble, or else we're going to have 20,000 years of radiation coming out of this thing.
Well, 2 miles down is way too far to do that. Of course, detonating a nuke in that zone could just trigger another earthquake. There really isn't much they can do about it, which is why you should never allow the money junkies to cut safety corners on any of these systems, because once it gets out of control, you just don't get it back. We're going to let you go here, and we're going to switch over to Chris in Las Vegas. Aloha, Chris. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, thank you, Michael. Since you had verbalized a lack of knowledge about what ELF was, and they also did on CNN this morning, it stands for Extreme Low Frequency.
Well, I know that's what it stands for. We got an ELF transmitter here on Hawaii that communicates with the submarines.
Well, absolutely. It's not greatly indifferent from the low-frequency thumping hum of the crap music they play in automobiles at extreme high, but they're long-range acoustic weapons of mass destruction, which can be used to discombobulate, to cause anxiety, incontinence, or other.
We're getting into brown note stuff here, and in point of fact, Chris is correct that ELF, at least one of the things ELF can stand for, is extreme low frequency, which are radio waves with a wavelength of a mile on a side that can pass right through the earth and right through the ocean and communicate to submarines that are submerged. And the bandwidth is so low that they basically send a very slow Morse code with 3-letter groups that they look in a code book to get the instructions. Usually it's come up and communicate with a high-speed communication means. But that's what it does. And we have one of those transmitters here in Hawaii. There's another one in the center of the United States of America. Over on the windward side of Hawaii, there's this old radio building that during World War II housed one of the very earliest versions of this technology. It was all very classified, and we shot some of the episodes for Lost in there, and it was just an amazing place to look at with all these gigantic coil forms and everything. And I know that some of the people who used to work there were trying to get it revived as a museum, and I think it would have been a good idea, but that just did not happen. But ELF is a communication method and really not useful for much of anything else. For one thing, you can't aim it. When you have ELF radio waves, they're going everywhere because they just penetrate everything, and they're just absolutely gigantic. Alrighty, let's see. Phone lines are empty here, so let's get back to the situation. And like I said, a lot of people are putting a lot of junk out there, trying to take the focus away and go off into all this other stuff. But it's very simple. MK Ultra, mind control, HARP, and ELF, and the rest of it. It's all speculation. Could be, could be, could be. We have a confirmation that the Washington D.C. Navy Yard shooter, Aaron Alexis, was on trazodone, a prescription antidepressant, with a known, proven history of triggering unexpected violent behavior. So Occam's razor applies here. We have a simple solution that makes sense. We don't need to go wandering off into science fiction territory, and at least some of the people trying to do that are more than likely working for public relations firms that are getting big, juicy contracts from those pharmaceutical companies to protect their profitability and their business interests here. So we're looking at this story. This is out of Ingenious Press. That is basically chastising the corporate media for going along with this idea of, oh, no, it's it's the video games that did it. Don't pay no attention to the medications this guy was on. The video games are the cause of violence in the United States of America. And that breaks down when you look at South Korea, because South Korea's per capita consumption of ultra-violent video games just completely overshadows the American market. It's huge over there, and yet South Korea does not seem to have the degree of social domestic violence that we have here in the United States of America. So the link between violent video games and violent behavior is very weak to begin with, and there's a school of thought that people who are allowed to vent their rage and frustration in video games are less likely to take their aggressions out on people in the real world. So it's all about the money. I mean, these medications, yes, most people who take these medications do not suffer adverse effect, but a significant number do. They are not 100% safe. And as I was mentioning earlier in the show, the news may or grudgingly may or may not cover the instances of mass shootings and violence and suicide linked to these drugs. But somebody who's on these SSRIs and all of a sudden finds himself getting into bar fights, that doesn't make the news. It's unreported. It's an unreported side effect. Domestic violence going up. Easy to blame it on the economy, but again, if 20% of Americans are on these medications, nobody wants to look at this because it's a threat to the profitability of the companies that are manufacturing and selling these drugs. But in terms of outright overt acts of violence, the documentation is there, and you need to go over to ssristories.com, look at all these documented cases. And again, I mentioned this yesterday, one of the ones that really stands out was this kid who was prescribed these medications for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and he just tried to kill himself. And they intervened, they saved him from killing himself, and when it was all over, they said, "Why'd you try and kill yourself?" And he says, "I don't know. It just popped into my head, and I went with it." And that's another aspect of these medications, and in particular SSRIs, poor impulse control. You'll just get an idea in your head and go with it. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, again, there appears to be a concerted effort by public relations firms working for the pharmaceutical agencies to try and pull the focus off the prescription antidepressant the shooter was on, and its already documented history of triggering random acts of extreme violence. And along with all the mind control, MK Ultra, Manchurian Candidate and stuff, and blaming video games, they're making a big deal out of this story about how a SWAT team was ordered to stand down at the U.S. Navy Yard, and it's being presented as somehow proof of nefarious intent and so forth. But if you actually read the story themselves, it's a jurisdictional issue. The tactical response team in question is assigned to protect the Capitol complex, the Capitol building and its immediate vicinity. That's their jurisdiction. Now, anybody who works in law enforcement understands that people in one jurisdiction don't just walk into another jurisdiction on their own. And so what appears to have happened is this tactical assault team called their supervisor for permission to get involved on a U.S. Navy military property, and the supervisor said, "No, that's not your jurisdiction." And they're trying to make a big deal out of it. Now, maybe it was a bad choice for the supervisor to make, but he was basically just enforcing the rules. So that's a non-issue as well. Of course, the gun grabbers are still out there. It's the guns. It's the guns. This one person over here did a bad thing with a gun, and he's dead now, so we're going to take the guns away from all those people who aren't doing bad things. And they're going after the assault rifles. They've already been caught lying about this guy having an AR-15. He didn't. He had the shotgun that he purchased legally, and he had a handgun that he took off of one of the security guards that he killed. That's all he had. There was no AR-15. But their push is back on. We've got to get those assault rifles away from the American people. You know, you're more likely to be beaten to death with a hammer than killed with an assault rifle. Why the focus on assault rifles? Well, because they are military-style weapons, and the federal government is scared out of its mind that you, the American people, having awakened up to the sheer volume of lies used to trick you and deceive you and rule you and control you, are reaching the breaking point in terms of saying it's time to fire this government and replace it with something that's going to work a little bit more for we the people, which this government clearly does not. But there's an interesting article over at Chuck Baldwin's site where he's saying, you know, guns don't kill people. Gun control laws are killing people. And he hammers home the point, and I was making the same point yesterday. We've had another mass shooting in another gun-free zone located inside Washington, D.C., which has some of the strictest gun control laws in the entire country. So this idea that gun-free zones and gun laws are going to protect people does not work. All of this stuff we have been sold for our safety so that we don't have the need to protect ourselves didn't work. NSA didn't know this guy was going to go ballistic. TSA didn't catch him. FBI didn't know he was going to do it. CIA didn't know he was going to do it. The police were not there in time to prevent the shooting. They just made a big show after it was all over, cleaning up the dead bodies and posing for the news cameras and saying, yes, it's a terrible thing. But the police are rarely, if ever, present to thwart a crime in progress. When a crime is taking place, there are only two parties there, the criminal and the victim. And it is up to the victim to protect themselves. Now, setting aside the entire issue of a federal government clearly preparing to make war on the American people in the 50 states, common sense has to tell you that the Second Amendment reserves to we the people, on an individual basis, the right to keep and bear arms equal to, if not superior to, those in the hands of the criminals. And the criminals are getting their assault rifles from Mexico, from the U.S. government's Fast and Furious program. And so all those people who are out there trying to take away your guns, we have to start asking, are they working for organized crime? And I mean the separate kind, not the government itself, but mafia, that kind of a situation, to create a safe work environment for their drug dealers and their robbers and their muggists and the rest of it. Because anti-gun is definitely pro-crime. Because every time guns are banned, crime goes up. Every time the public is allowed to carry weapons, crime goes down. It's been proven time and time and time again. So why do our politicians, who at the moment only have a 9% approval rating, I might add, want to take away our guns in the face of rising crime, in the face of people who are whacked out on prescription psychiatric medications, in a country where it's known the police will not be there in time to stop the crime? Average wait time in response to a 9/11 call is running about 19 minutes in this country. By 19 minutes, the crime is over and done with, the criminal has left, the victim is either dead, raped, or robbed. And why do our politicians think this is a good idea? Anyway, now moving on to Syria, another place where the U.S. government is just showering weapons all over everybody. Apparently, late last night, the United States backed off on their demand that the UN resolution on Syria include an authorization for the use of military force. They were not going to get that through there, so now they've backed off. And they're already backing off the chemical weapons issue entirely in the American media, because it's becoming very evident that, first of all, nobody believes that absurd story that Assad gassed women and children of his own supporters in front of the UN chemical weapons inspectors. And now they're trying to shift back, say, oh, forget about the chemical weapons. Look at all the other bad things Assad has done. He's a terrible person. We should all go kill him just on the basis of that. So they're trying to change the push, trying to change the focus on this whole situation. And they're not getting any traction because, again, we've got problems in this country that have to be dealt with first before we go meddling in somebody else's country. I mean, we've got Obama and the Congress out there fighting over an increase in the debt ceiling, and yet Obama wants to spend billions more dollars in yet another invasion of yet another country that has not actually attacked us. Now, there's been a bit of a development regarding the so-called forensic evidence that was in the UN Chemical Weapons Inspector's report on Syria. Now, the UN report itself did not assign any blame. They were ordered only to determine if chemical weapons had been used, which was never in dispute, but not to point the finger of blame at anybody. But the U.S. and Great Britain are basically reading between the lines of this UN report and saying, aha, this proves that Syria did it. And they're focusing on a particular piece of ordnance, the M14 artillery rocket, which bears Russian markings, to say, aha, we know Russia is giving weapons to Assad. This must be one of them, hence he used it. That's their entire case. There's a couple of problems with that. First of all, that particular model weapon is no longer being manufactured by Russia or sent to Assad. And the markings that are on that case seem to point at an alternative source called Bear Spares, which was a United States program which where the U.S. would take captured Russian munitions and provide them to nations that had captured Russian weapons in order to put them together and create a fighting force. And one of those nations was Israel. So this case that this M14 rocket unequivocally points to Assad has already fallen apart. And I think this is a major part of the evidence that Russia is bringing up to the United Nations right now. And even within the UN Chemical Weapons Report, it says it appears that evidence was handled and moved prior to the arrival of the investigation team. So even the UN inspectors are saying stuff was moved around, stuff was planted, manipulated. So you can't read that report and say, oh, this unequivocally points the finger of guilt at Assad. And again, the initial story is absurd on the face of it. The story is Assad lets the UN chemical weapons inspectors into his country, and on the very day they arrive, Assad launches a chemical weapons attack not against the leadership of the hired mercenaries trying to oust him, but against women and children of the Alawite sect who are Assad supporters, and he does it virtually in front of those UN inspectors. It doesn't make sense. Assad doesn't have a motive to do something that stupid. The story was absurd on the face of it, and this government apparently believes, or wants to believe, that you American people are just stupid enough to buy it because, hey, you fell for that nuclear weapon in Iraq thing, and you fell for torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin, and you fell for Spanish mines in Havana Harbor. They really do think you're morons, and the proof of that was in his speech on the economy. Obama says raising the debt ceiling will not increase the national debt. If that doesn't prove he's on SSRIs, nothing will. We'll be right back with phone calls after these. America, welcome back to the show here. We're going to grab some phone calls. Kyle in Pennsylvania. Aloha, Kyle. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Michael. I'm not to drag the show back too much, but I wanted to talk about the SSRIs you were speaking about earlier. Mm-hmm. And I've never taken them. I've never had any sort of experience with them. But from what I understand, they do nothing for depression or anything like that. What they simply do is dull all the senses and dull all the emotions that you have. And from what I understand, they somewhat create a barrier in between you and reality, where you somehow feel like you're removed from, or, you know, you lose your sense of fear, you lose your sense of happiness, you lose your sense of depression, and you're just very much removed. And I do think that that played a huge part in the attacks in Washington at the Navy base. But I must say that the timing was very, very fortuitous for the Obama administration. You know, the fact that his security clearance wasn't taken away from him for multiple reasons And the time when it hit with, all the controversy around Syria and everybody having their full attention focused on that, it just...
Well, there's no question that Obama, as soon as he was aware that the shooting took place, was thinking, how can I use this as a distraction to push the gun control agenda? That's the way the people inside Washington, D.C. think. Never let a good crisis go to waste. And they piled onto it, and we had this huge reaction of everybody going over to the yard. I'm sure they were hoping it was going to turn out to be an Iranian or a Syrian or a Muslim, and it fizzled on them. And so, the only thing they've got left is to point to it and say, oh, we've got to ban the guns, we've got to ban the guns. But again, anything that happens, the first thing these people think about is, how can I use this to push my particular agenda?
100%, absolutely. But it was... The shooting, and you look at, you said Occam's razor, I say City Bono. Who benefits from the shooting?
Well, not every... This, as far as I can tell, this looks to have been just, another one of these well-documented cases where somebody was on these medications and they flipped out. And, again, that suits the Occam's razor. Anyway, Kyle, we're going to let you go and switch over to John in Barbados. Aloha, John. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Michael. Yes, talking on the chemical weapons issue, I think it's backfired seriously. That's why they're backing off, because questions on the blogs and even in the mainstream media now are asking the question, if Syria has to give up these weapons, Britain should give up its nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Israel should give up its nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. The U.S. should give up its nuclear and biological weapons. And this pressure from the blogs is building against these weapons systems, against everybody that maintains these huge stockpiles. And it's backfiring seriously. That's I think why they're backing off from using this against Syria, because it really is backfiring against Israel mainly.
Well, it's backfiring on several levels, most assuredly with the fact that, again, that initial story was just absurd on the face of it, and, they're trying to raise on a busted flush, but they're trying to basically resell the war with Syria on the basis of Assad is bad, he's doing bad things to his people. But again, most Americans understand there is no civil war in Syria. It is a covert attempt at overthrow by outside hired forces. 95% of the Free Syria Army are not from Syria. 70% of the Syrian people support Assad. Only 10% support the hired mercenaries. The other 20% are undecided. This is not a civil war. It's an overthrow, just like they did in Libya, just like they tried to do in Iran in 2009.
Absolutely, Michael. I agree 100%. But it seems to me that the pressure is building to remove these weapons from all these nations, not just Syria.
I agree, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's absolutely a good thing. We know nuclear weapons certainly are bad. We know chemical weapons are terrible. The biological weapons, though, we're in the era of genetic modification, and the idea, some of these biological weapons, if they make the same sort of mistakes on them that they did on the GMO, you could have an extinction-level event with some of these things. And I agree, they should all be destroyed, and it should be everybody, not just our chemical weapons are good and their chemical weapons are bad, which is the attitude we're seeing out of the United States and Israel.
Yeah, the problem I see with the biological systems is that now with this genetic modification, they can actually target particular gene pools, that affects this particular gene pool really seriously, and the rest, it's just a bad cold. So
yeah, Israel's been working on that sort of thing for a great many years, and again, I agree, these things should be gotten rid of. They're playing with potentially wiping out all life on Earth, but the money junkies, hey, that's okay. They've got their bunkers.
Well, it's now extended, with all the GMOs, that you cannot buy brown rice that doesn't contain some quantity of GMO. Mm-hmm. It's spread so far. The same thing is happening with corn and wheat. We had that incident where they did a trial in a wheat field, and 300 miles away, suddenly this GMO appeared in other farmers' fields. It's ridiculous.
It is, and it's wrecked the American wheat export industry right now because nobody wants to buy any wheat grown in America on the assumption that it's probably been contaminated. My big concern, of course, goes back to that experimental epicite corn that was developed with funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where they literally created a genetically modified corn that sterilizes anybody who eats it. And if those genes blew into the wild and are contaminating corn all over the world, that's a serious, serious problem.
Absolutely. I mean, the other experiments are equally horrendous. The deliberate infection of people in Guatemala with sexually transmitted diseases, syphilis and gonorrhea. I mean, that's come to the fore now. This is beyond. It's just beyond the pale. It's
yeah,
just
there are
evil.
There are too many money junkies out there considering themselves gods with godlike powers and exercising them. And of course, all gods have feet of clay. John, I'm going to let you go here and try and squeeze in one more phone call before the top of the hour. Keith in Montana. Aloha, Keith. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, nice to your wife there. Hey, I sent you an article there about how the senators, U.S. senators, now going after the Russian banks, alleging that they're supporting terrorism, i.e. Assad there. And I just thought that was absolutely hilarious, you know.
They're throwing a tantrum, and everybody perceives it that way. They're throwing tantrums. They can't get what they want, so they're going to flop it down on the floor and kick and scream and cry until they get the war they want.
That's right. The other thing I wanted, someone else had brought up this thing about we know daily that the so-called brown shirts of the Nazism, you know, they had brought a bunch of compared photos of these different, tactical agencies that had responded to the Boston shooting. And in it showed that all these departments have the same exact uniforms, just different stick-on labels of whether it's FBI,
the patches are all on Velcro. They just take them off and put a different one on. Yeah.
And it was really interesting there because if you look at the history of Nazi Germany, which I hate to do like that because a lot of that I don't see is always that bad like that, although it was kind of gross in a way. But anyway, the fascism that you explain all the time like that can be seen daily in the way that our country is going.
Yes.
We continually have the fascist government that is aligned with its so-called commercial entities, but we have the torturing, we have the secret prisons. I mean, the list goes on, and if people don't wake up, I don't know what the heck's going to happen.
Well, people are waking up. I mean, that should be very obvious from the backlash against the lies about Assad gassing his own people. The American people and the people of the world are awake. Zbigniew Brzezinski said, yes, it's a global political awakening. Of course, from his point of view, that's a bad thing because they can't control us anymore. We got to take a break. Okay, thanks a lot, Keith. We got to let you go here. We're going to take a break for Phyllis Schlafly and some commercials, and we'll be back with hour number 2 of our program. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, to hour number 2 here. We're going to go back to the phone. Scott in Virginia. Aloha, Scott. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. Do you realize that if our federal government was an individual, a person, and went in to apply for a federal job, he would be turned down because of his credit history and his criminal record?
Yeah, they'd be in trouble. They'd be out there on those homeless lines. They'd be coming over to our little food distribution program and say, can I have a loaf of bread, please?
And they would not be able to own a gun either, because when you sell guns to drug cartels, that would show up on your background check.
Well, you need to understand the concept of power, and power is simply when a selected group is able to do things that the ordinary people are not. We are brainwashed from our childhood to always tell the truth and expect that we're being told the truth, but government lies to rule us. We're taught thou shalt not steal, and yet government is constantly stealing from everybody under various excuses. We're taught thou shalt not kill, but government makes war. Obama is clearly violating U.S. law in his Syria policy, and that's basically what it is. Now, this nation was set up to be a nation of laws that everybody had to follow up to and including the President of the United States of America. And we have gotten away from that to a fascist dictatorship where laws are only applied to the lower classes, and the ultra-rich and the ultra-politically powerful can pretty much do what they want and literally, in many cases, get away with murder.
was because I wanted to share some thoughts about this Syria thing, which has really gotten me upset what Obama tried to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think Obama is up against a Middle Eastern leader that no other president's gone up against, because with Bashir Assad, we have somebody who is very articulate. He did not pursue power like other leaders typically have, as far as murdering his way up. I get the impression when I see interviews with him that he had rather stayed in London as an ophthalmologist rather than where he is now. So Americans see this guy who's very articulate, very calm. He's not out there, slamming a sword down on a podium like Noriega or with a rifle in his hand like Saddam. And our government's just not ready to deal with somebody like that. And Americans see it. They see it. They're awake. Americans are not dumb. They've just been asleep for a long while. And we're waking up. And this Syria thing, like I said the other day, is our fruit stand being kicked. Just like Tunisia, the fruit stand in Tunisia being knocked over, and that causing a revolution. We are waking up now to the lies. And I have to tell you, I voted for Obama. I'm a liberal. And I'm ready to impeach him and Biden. I would rather have 2 years of Boehner, because at least he can't destroy my party from the inside out like Obama is.
Well, I get all this hate mail from Democrats and everything, but I actually supported Obama over McCain and Romney, who I think, I still to this day think would have been a lot worse in terms of trying to plunge us into these wars here. But I'm ready to impeach the entire government.
I agree with you. And I followed your advice about calling my representative. I'm from Virginia, so I called my two senators, Warner and Kane, and my local congressman, Bobby Scott. And I'll just share just quickly what I said to each of them. First, I checked their websites to see the latest press release on their views on Syria before I called each of their offices. And then I let them know that I'm a liberal Democrat. These folks I'm calling are all Democrats. And I said, just want to let you know that if you have evidence of who committed this attack in Syria, you should display that on your website, because you don't have anything on your website with evidence. And two, I'm a liberal Democrat. I did not spend the last 10 years complaining about Bush's warmongering and lying us into war so that I could have my own Democratic president or leaders do the same thing to me. And I let them know that if they don't put evidence up, and they don't separate themselves from the lies about Syria, not only will I not vote for them in the next election, but I will actively support and fund whoever runs against them, no matter what party they come from. Liberals are very angry with Obama now. We're even talking about starting our own separate party. And I will drive a Democrat out of office that betrays me. I don't care if a Republican replaces me or a Tea Party person. If they betray me, they're gone. Whatever it takes to get rid of them out of office, I will do.
Well, one of the other traditional paradigms that is probably on the wane is every election that comes up, the two parties, Republican and Democrat, figure they can always count on this one block of voters who will always vote Republican or always vote Democrat, and the campaigns are concentrating on those swing voters, which is a small percentage. But I think the swing voters are going to be much larger in the coming election next year, because I think members of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are feeling very much betrayed right now, and they are starting to seriously think about the wisdom of simply voting for somebody who claims to be the head of your particular party. And I know the Democrats got a huge wake-up call during the Democratic National Convention in last year's election, where they voted down amending the platform to include Israel, and the party leadership just said, oh, it sounds to me like it passed, and they amended the platform. And these were their own elected party delegates who were booing from the seats out there at this obvious betrayal and breakdown in the mechanism. And so I think blind, unquestioning support of both traditional parties is very, very much in decline right now.
I think what's the irony of this is there are so many Americans who are turned off by both parties that the next election cycle, corporate America is going to own both parties, because these parties are not going to be able to get a dime out of the individual.
Well, unfortunately, the corporations already own both parties, because the campaign finance laws over the last 2 decades have been skewed to allow corporations to pour more and more money into campaigns and candidates. Citizens United was an absolute hammer blow against the American people have anything to say about the political races. I think a lot of people are probably, I think next year's election is going to have a huge turnout because a lot of people are going to want to vote the current incumbents out. And it's rather interesting. When people are happy with the government, the voter turnout tends to be less and less. And when the people get angry, that's when they're going to get down to the polls, and they'll stand in those lines for 4 and 5 hours waiting for the few working machines. And by the way, we got to really work on getting those electronic machines shut down because that's the doorway to the massive election fraud that has crippled this nation's political system.
I agree. And one last thing, Mike, you know that the Federal Reserve Charter comes up this December, and I have one humorous comment to make about this, and it's not really meant to be taken seriously. But I took a look at all the previous Federal Reserve chairmen, and I noticed something that they all have in common, or most of them, about 85% have in common. And as a good Protestant, I would really like it if they give a Catholic a chance to be in the Federal Reserve before it goes down in flames.
Well, you don't have to worry about that because I know a lot of people are talking about how the Federal Reserve Charter was a 100-year charter, and originally it was, but in the 1930s, in the depths of that depression, Congress amended the Federal Reserve Charter to make it open-ended. There is no built-in expiration. Now, that being said, Congress can rescind that charter anytime they want with a simple majority, and their only obligation under that charter is to return to the bankers the $1 billion that was loaned to the U.S. government in 1913. Now, back in 1913, $1 billion was a lot of money. These days, it's pocket change for that government. And, of course, the president at any time can bypass the Federal Reserve by invoking his authority under the Constitution to issue a public currency directly from the Treasury, the way John F. Kennedy tried to do before they gunned him down. It's really a case of we can talk all we want to the federal government about shutting down the Federal Reserve. They don't want to because they're sharing in the proceeds from this gigantic, fraudulent scam foisted on the American people for the last 100 years. They're in on the take. They're part of the problem. And so we're just going to have to sit here quietly and patiently until the system comes crashing down, which seems inevitable at this point, and be prepared to restart our nation on our own terms, which means no private central bank and a return to the original constitutional restrictions on that central government. We got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right America, back. Welcome back to the show. And Secretary of State John Kerry just finished a press conference where he's basically out there raising on a busted flush. He's gazing into the camera, and he's waving his hands, saying, Assad gassed his people. Assad gassed his people. You will believe when we tell you Assad gassed his people. And the story just doesn't make any sense. It never, ever did. But they can't back off and say, yeah, you caught us. We lied to you again. So they're still out there pushing and basically saying the UN has to pass a comprehensive resolution against Syria's chemical weapons, which is probably going to happen. And Syria will then comply, as Iraq did. Then the U.S. will lie and say, oh, Syria did not abide by the United Nations resolution, and that will be their excuse to go and invade, except, of course, that the UN is not going to pass a resolution that authorizes military force. So they're still scrambling trying to find this thing. We're going to grab a phone call here. Scott in Wisconsin. Aloha, Scott. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, Michael, how you doing there, brother? I've been cleaning up from a head cold for 3 days, man. It feels like somebody took a shotgun and blew my head off, but I'm still surviving, brother.
Okay.
And those natural medicines the good guy gave us. Hey, you know, Mike, was something that I watched this morning when I got up and got my son off to school. I watched a great video on the creatures from the sea. And what I mean by that is the nuclear submarines. Mike, we talk about the aircraft carriers. You know, you talked about over there with the Dolphins, with Israel. It is amazing the magnitude of what the cargo they hold on these creatures from the sea. And I think that what you're saying, brother, that is so crucial for the American people to wake up now, and they are. Hopefully they'll wake up more. But, Mike, when I go through the years in the past and see from the heart steadfast, see the pattern what they are doing, they are going to still push the envelope to go and attack Syria because this guy running our country don't care. He wants to go in there, and they want to get to Iran.
That's exactly right. From their point of view, this war is essential. They have to get it some way or the other, or the dollar's going to collapse internationally.
That's exactly right. God bless you, brother. You're awake. And you know what? What amazes me, Mike, is this, and I'm able to, thank God I can still think right now with this cold, but people sit there and say, concentrate on a minute thing about the United States. And what I mean by that is, this is a global thing, what you just mentioned, that will collapse. This isn't just the United States of America. So, if you want, what I'm trying to say is, if you go and look on the back of your dollar bill, and you see the big pyramid, guess who sits on the top of that pyramid? The good old United States. So, I would love for a peaceful resolution. I always say that, man, Mike, I'm a man of peace like you. But when I see the situation, they come out early yesterday with that first box of saying, oh, we're going to put another quantitating 3 out to pump up the old hot air balloon. You see the track record of what they have done in the past, where they set up for war. And it just looks like that, brother. And I just wanted to comment on that. So, Mike, take care. If you wanted to comment, do so. And take care, brother.
All right. Thanks an awful lot. I mean, we have already laid out the inevitable 3-step process that leads from a private central bank issuing all the public currencies alone at interest to major war. Because the instant that first pretty printed piece of paper goes into circulation, more money is owed to that private central bank than actually exists. That's why it is impossible to pay off the debt. It is a system of enslavement, and it works because you believe that somehow you owe that debt to these private central bankers, and all they put out is ink and paper. And they'll put out the money, and everybody has to borrow money for whatever they're doing, starting a business, paying their employees, buying inventory, going to the store, going to the supermarket. All of that money enters circulation as a loan at interest, and all of its accruing interest as it passes from hand to hand to hand to hand. And the debt builds up to the point where all of a sudden the people start slowing down their financial activity because they're afraid of the scale of the debt. The credit cards are too high, the mortgage payments are too high, and they stop borrowing more money. But because it's a pyramid scheme that only survives when there's always an increase in borrowing, that's what they mean when they say the economy is growing, it means an increase in total debt. That's when the Keynesian economists come in and say the government has to start borrowing on behalf of the people, and I might add without their permission, to keep that pyramid going. Then when you reach a point where the people won't borrow any more money and the government can't borrow any more money, that's when the big wars are kicked off. Because war will force everybody to just borrow like crazy to fight the war, and when the war is all over, borrow even more to rebuild from the war. And when this little 3-step scam gets done, ordinary people like you and I, we have pretty much what we had before the war, except our graveyards are a lot bigger, and we're back on the hook to the private bankers for another 50 to 100 years. That's the scam. And they succeeded in playing that scam on the entire planet twice now, and they're going for the 3rd time. And that's what's going on here. Now, getting back to this whole Syrian situation, like I said, Kerry just finished his little press conference, and they're trying to basically jingoize the argument why Assad did it, and now it's down to simply, well, sarin was used on these poor people, and Assad has sarin, therefore it had to be him. And that is complete nonsense. It's been known all along. The hired mercenaries had sarin gas. Turkey just handed down an indictment against the Syrian rebels they arrested in possession of sarin. We know that other players in the region, like Israel, have sarin to use for a false flag. There is no foundation for this story, and again, common sense tells you that initial story is nonsense. Just stop and think about it for a minute, what they're trying to get you to believe, that Assad is going to have the inspectors come in, gas women and children from his own supporters in front of those inspectors. Why would he do something that stupid? And the answer is he wouldn't. Who benefits from this gas attack? Obviously the United States does, looking for an excuse to invade. Israel does. They're looking for an excuse for the United States to invade. All of this so-called intelligence that pointed the finger at Assad came from Israel, which lied to us about Saddam's nuclear weapons, lied about who was attacking the USS Liberty. The only reason anybody in Washington, D.C. still listens to anything Israel has to say is Israel's handing out huge campaign checks every election. They've bought our government out from under us. Now, little while ago, Vladimir Putin penned a letter to Americans, which was published in the New York Times and a bunch of other places, in which he came across as sounding very reasonable, pragmatic, calm, going through the facts and information to basically build the case that we can't really say who did the gas attack, and just hauling off and attacking Syria's government without just cause or provocation is a violation of international law. Now, John McCain has fired back with an op-ed he published in the Russian papers that came across as just screaming tantrum and just name-calling Putin, and everything he accused Russia of doing is what the United States is doing in terms of its own people, spying on us all and so forth. And it was published in Pravda, and everyone was saying, you know, what is going on with John? He comes across as like this raving kook. Well, there's an old lawyer's joke that goes, when the facts are against you, argue the law. When the law is against you, argue the facts. When both the facts and law are against you, call the other guy names, and that's what McCain is doing, because the facts are against the U.S. agenda in Syria. The law is against U.S. action in Syria. And so all McCain has left is to shout, bluff, and bluster at the other guy. We'll be right back. America, after this. Welcome back to the show here. And McCain's op-ed in Pravda is apparently the opening shot in a new campaign to demonize Russia. Ooh, Russians are bad. You don't want to listen to anything the Russians have to tell you. No, you listen only to the U.S. government, and you listen only to the U.S. corporate media. You don't want to listen to the Russians or all those bloggers and independent media people who hate the flag and apple pie and all the rest of that. So it's just classic Cold War propaganda. And along these same lines, saw this story over in Politico.com claiming there is a new Gallup poll where the majority of Americans view Russia and Vladimir Putin as a foe, that our former status as allies in the world has gone away, and that the majority of Americans now hate Russia and hate Putin, and they're ready to go to war against him, which, of course, is what's ultimately going to happen. If they go into Syria and Iran, we're going to be at war with Russia. So as a check, we did our own poll at whatreallyhappened.com. Do you see Russia and Putin as a foe? 3% said yes. 97% said no. I'm beginning to wonder just who it is Gallup calls when they need to get these numbers saying, ooh, yes, we think Russia's bad. There's another poll out there saying 2/3 of America don't even trust the polls anymore, for reasons we just illustrated. Now, the Pentagon is proposing a new plan to equip and train the moderate Syrian rebels. This is in response to concerns raised by our own military about, hey, all of a sudden we're fighting on the same side as Al-Qaeda. And so the U.S. is saying, oh, no, the Al-Qaeda, we're going to kick them out. You're fighting on the side of the moderates here. And it's, again, falling apart over in Syria and breaking into factions, because now the different factions of the rebels are again fighting each other in the border city of Azaz. And apparently the Islamic rebels have declared war on all the non-Islamic rebels, and they're killing each other off. Talk about a botched foreign policy. Now, as we mentioned earlier, toward the end of this month, Netanyahu is going to be meeting with Obama on the subject of Iran. Netanyahu's already back out there. You've got to do Iran. You've got to kill Iran for us. Go kill Iran. They're bad people. You should hate them because we hate them. And send your American kids to make war on Iran because our Israeli children are really way too precious. And the White House has confirmed the meeting is going to take place, which is very interesting because Obama is refusing to meet with Syria's President Assad when they show up for the United Nations General Assembly meeting. And so Obama has just thrown away the last vestige of any illusion of the United States being an impartial and objective arbiter of Middle Eastern peace. Now, one of the issues that is going to be raised in the General Assembly is an Arab nation motion for a nuclear-free Middle East. And, of course, they're saying, obviously, that is going to mean having to deal with Israel's nuclear arsenal. And even in this article that came out in Haaretz, they were using the phrase, the assumed nuclear arsenal in Israel. Well, there's nothing assumed about it. Israel now openly talks about it in the Knesset. Germany has acknowledged they've known for years that Israel arms those Dolphin-class submarines with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. Documents that surfaced from the former government of South Africa proved Israel's been trying to sell nuclear weapons to other countries, which is the very activity the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Israel will not sign, is designed to prevent. Now, the U.S., of course, is trying to calm this all down and say, oh, no, if you single out Israel, it will harm efforts for a nuclear-free Middle East. And boy, they have to think you are just absolutely single-digit IQ to try that one on you. Because let's say we're going to ban drunk driving, which I think is already banned, but for the purposes of our exercise, we want to ban drunk driving. How does it harm the dialogue to focus on the actual drunk driver in the room? Why is it in any way unfair to put the focus of criticism for drunk driving on the actual drunk driver? The same applies here. Israel is the only nation in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. Period. End of discussion. Israel is a nuclear power, and they are the only one in the region, and they have a long history of belligerence toward their neighbors. And just like when we have a ban on drunk driving, we focus rightly on the actual drunk driver, talk of banning nuclear weapons in the Middle East has to start with the nation that actually has them. And the U.S. has just demonstrated one more time that when it comes to the United Nations, they are Israel's bitch. There is no other word for it. To come out with this nonsense about, whoa, yes, we're in favor of a nuclear-free Middle East, as long as you don't talk about the one nation that actually has them. All right, turning to the economy and looking at the stock market, the rush of euphoria that greeted the Fed's announcement that they would not reduce quantitative easing sort of wore off, and two of the three markets are slightly in the red. It's not a major downturn. Mark Faber is out there saying we are in quantitative easing unlimited, which is sort of the new version of quantitative easing infinity that we talked about not too long ago. And as I said before, they're addicted. They can't stop. The tremendous uplift of the stock market following the Fed announcement demonstrated to everybody how dependent on that stock market is on this continuing injection of capital. $85 billion a month. Half of that is being used to buy these failed mortgage bundles off of Wall Street and dump them on the American people. And the other half, of course, is being used to buy more U.S. government debt. The U.S. Treasury prints up a Treasury bond and sends it over to the Federal Reserve that prints up a bunch of money and sends it back. It's a double shuffle flim-flam to hide the fact that they're simply printing the money out of thin air. And they're pouring that money all over Wall Street to make it look like the system is still working. And it's very obvious at this point it hasn't. It isn't working. And when they talk about whether or not they're going to raise the debt ceiling, and they will, let's be honest, they're going to raise the debt ceiling because the only alternative is to say, oh, all right, we resign, we quit, come in, see if you can do a better job, and I'm sure that we can. But the United States is bankrupt. They cannot cover their obligations other than by simply creating new money out of thin air. Last month, the International Monetary Fund released its annual review of U.S. economic policy, and they've announced the U.S. government is now bankrupt. Now, the U.S. officially acknowledges a debt of something like $16 trillion, but more and more economists are coming in there and looking at numbers coming out of the Congressional Budget Office. And when you include in all the unfunded mandates and the off-the-book financing that they use to conceal the scale of the problem, the United States government is $202 trillion in debt, which is more than 15 times what they're trying to tell you the debt problem is. And this is what happens when you run a massive Ponzi scheme economy for 100 years. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, in his speech about raising the debt ceiling earlier in the week, Obama actually came out and said, raising the debt ceiling does not increase our debt. Well, if it's not going to increase our debt, why do you need to raise the debt ceiling? It's like this claim about Assad and gas weapons. When you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. And by the way, every other time They have raised the debt ceiling. Yeah, the debt goes up. They max out that new credit card just as fast as they can. And Obama actually believed that the American people were going to believe it when he said raising the debt ceiling does not increase the debt. He actually believed that. Got to be on SSRIs. Now, a group of Australian lawyers is suing the Wall Street ratings agencies over the misrepresentation of the trustworthiness of those mortgage-backed securities back in 2008. Now, when the U.S. Congress had hearings, the ratings agencies excused it, saying, well, it's just our opinion. You shouldn't pay that much attention to it. And you need to understand those top three rating agencies are paid by the Wall Street firms that issue the securities. I'm Wall Street firm Engulf and Devour, Inc., and I'm going to issue this security backed by Lint. And I hire the rating agency to rate my offering, and the rating agency takes my money and says, yes, it's AAA. And I put it out there, and it collapses. And the rating agency says, it was just my opinion. That's what happened here in the United States of America. Amsterdam successfully sued those rating agencies for fraud, for rating those offerings AAA when very clearly they were not. And now Australia is joining in, and I think the whole world ought to do that. The whole world ought to sue those Wall Street rating agencies for being part of a criminal fraud. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And the situation is deteriorating in virtually every nation that is enslaved to a private central bank. And if there is a bright spot in all of this, it is because of globalism linking all these private central banks together into a single network. When it comes down, it's all going to come down, and it will be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to restart the economies of the world free from the slavery of private central banking. Now, over in Greece, they're back rioting again. Over there, apparently, there was actually a murder within the political class itself. A right-winger stabbed a left-winger to death. Now they're trying to ban the far-right party. There's talk of a new civil strike. Only last week, the Greek politicians were saying they can't do any more austerity. They're at the edge of collapse, and it looks like it's starting to happen. Not getting a lot of coverage of that in the American corporate media. Same thing down in Acapulco, in Mexico. They've had some major problems down there, exacerbated by floods and so forth. They're having food riots down there. So the whole planet is now very fragile. Used to be the common wisdom that you would set up your infrastructure, your food supply, sewage, power, whatever, and there would be a margin for error. There'd be backups to keep things running. And now it's all stretched so thin, it's ready to break and shatter. That's what happens when the money junkies are allowed to make safety decisions here. Interesting story. This came out of Tech Dirt. Apparently, the New York Police Department has been classifying its own documents for more than a decade. And it's caused a lot of people to kind of scratch their head because under New York law, the police department is not allowed to classify their documents to withhold them from the public. All police records are public records. They have to be there to be inspected by people looking for police misconduct. And so apparently, at least since 2003, the New York Police Department has been taking some of their files and saying, you cannot look at these. It's institutionalized cover-up. There is no legitimate legal ground for the New York Police Department to be concealing its records from the public unless the New York Police Department has been doing things they're not supposed to be doing. And we know they mounted this massive spy operation against Arab Muslims in New York following 9/11. Even though the only people actually arrested near the World Trade Towers on 9/11 were Israeli Mossad agents. Another embarrassment for the much beleaguered Transportation Security Administration. Apparently, immigration just arrested a TSA officer, David Alexander Diaz-Torres, for running a human smuggling ring to get illegal aliens into and around the United States of America. And it just adds to a growing list of crimes being committed by TSA agents. We know that theft from luggage is epidemic in the TSA. They're causing more damage to America than the terrorists are in terms of the sheer economic scale of what they're doing. And, of course, they've been terrible for tourism out here in Hawaii. They want to avoid a debt ceiling crisis. They want to control spending. Let's put TSA on that list of agencies that have to go, that accomplish absolutely nothing and cause a lot of harm, because in all of its years of operation, the TSA has never actually caught a genuine terrorist. Stolen a lot of iPads, dropped and smashed a laptop of mine, probably contributed to an explosion of sexually transmitted diseases as they grope the crotches of travelers, because those gloves they wear are for the TSA's protection, not yours, and they don't change them as they go from crotch to crotch to crotch to crotch. Plus, those naked body scanners are now known to be causing skin cancer. It was just a huge moneymaker for people who sell rubber gloves and chemical swabs and body scanners. We don't have money for schools. We don't have money for hospitals. We don't have money for roads. Don't have money to take care of the nation. But by golly, plenty of money to spy on you and keep watch on you and grab your crotches, sexually molest your wives and your daughters, all in the name of national security. If I'm not allowed to fondle your wife's titties, the terrorists will win. Seeing more and more articles out there saying it's time to impeach Obama. And he has committed impeachable offenses. Remember, use of the IRS to target political enemies was an article of impeachment for Richard Milhouse Nixon. And it certainly should be for Barack Obama. Not that I think this Congress has the spine to actually do their duty. Here's another very, very bizarre story coming up on the top of the hour. Apparently, over at Northeastern University in Boston, there's a group of Jewish students who are demanding an investigation into anti-Semitism on that campus. Because as these students go around proclaiming the virtues and joys and wonders of Israel, they seem to be running into some opposition on the campus. And that must be anti-Semitism. And it's got to be investigated, and it's got to be put down. And this is another attempt by Israel to hijack America's education system and turn it into a pro-Israel propaganda machine. Not everyone likes Israel. And it's got nothing to do with who Israel is or what religion they follow. It's because of how they act. It therefore follows that when one espouses support for Israel, one is likely to meet a contrary opinion. And that is not anti-Semitism, but an exercise of the First Amendment right to freely express your opinion without fear of reprisals. Can you imagine Nazis deflecting just criticism of Hitler by screaming, "You're just being anti-German. Hitler didn't do anything wrong, you just hate the German people. You're anti-Aryan." It would be laughable, and yet Israel has gotten away with this trick for decades. Remember, there was that former member of the Knesset that was interviewed over on Democracy Now! Who just said, yeah, it's a trick. When somebody asks a question that Israel can't or won't answer, they just say, oh, you're being an anti-Semite, to shut them up. Except it doesn't work anymore, because they overused it. They burned it out. It lost its shock value. Oh, you're being an anti-Semite. Okay. Anti-Semitism is hating Jews or Arabs, who are also Semitic, I might add, just because they're Jews and Arabs. That's race hate. And yes, that's wrong. But Israel has hijacked the term to mean anybody who questions the policies of the government of Israel. And that is a very inappropriate use of the word, because nobody is objecting to Israel's identity or religion or culture. They're objecting to their behavior. And those students at Northeastern University have a First Amendment right to stand up to those Jewish students and say, look, Israel's behaving badly. Israel used chemical weapons against the Gazans in 2009. The UN confirmed chemical weapons used by Israel against Gaza. Nobody's making a big deal about that. Oh, it's all Assad, and he gassed the women and children of his own supporters. And so they just fall back on whining and screaming, oh, you're being an anti-Semite. You just hate us because we're Jewish. No, we hate us because you're annoying. Now, we have talked a lot about the incestuous relationship between the corporate media and the government, and underscoring that today comes this announcement. The top editor for Time magazine, Richard Stengel, is leaving Time to go over and work for the State Department. So it's just all the same bunch of people, that revolving door between big pharma and the government, and big media and the government, and big banking and the government. It's just a club, and as George Carlin used to say, it's a big club and you're not in it. He was absolutely right. I think George Carlin is one of those individuals that we probably did not appreciate as much as we should have until after we had lost him. And that is a tragedy. Going to take a break for Phyllis Schlafly and some commercials. We'll be back with hour number 3 after these. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And the phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. I think it's Dan now sitting in our control room, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. And I want to take a step back here to Obama's comment on how raising the debt ceiling won't raise the debt. Because I was out on Facebook talking about this, and the usual government propagandists were out there hurling abuse like, oh, you just don't understand macroeconomics. You know, you don't know enough to know what's going on. Rely on these academics and the government officials, and there, when they say that raising the debt ceiling doesn't raise the debt, you should believe them. Well, I understand macroeconomics probably a lot better than they do. I also understand record numbers of Americans on food stamps. I understand record amount of decay in our national infrastructure. I understand a record wealth disparity enforced by law in this country. And I'm wondering if maybe Obama doesn't think you're all stupid enough to believe it when he says raising the debt ceiling won't raise the debt. Maybe he's stupid enough to believe that, to listen to all these macroeconomic authorities to say, oh, no, you can raise the debt ceiling and it won't raise the debt, even though history says exactly the opposite. And we're sort of in this whole new Orwellian world right now. Freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, war is peace, warming is cooling, raising the debt ceiling doesn't raise the debt. You seem to be in trouble. Now, Tuesday, as you're probably already aware, was Constitution Day, and we covered a few stories, few examples out of many, about how the public school system is now attempting to rewrite the Constitution and teach the altered version to our children to convince them that the Second Amendment does not guarantee the individual citizen a right to keep and bear arms, even though the United States Supreme Court ruled in the Heller case that the individual right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. And now there's a very bizarre story from last Tuesday and Constitution Day, and this happened apparently in Modesto Junior College in California, that told a student that he could not pass out copies of the United States Constitution outside the Student Center on Constitution Day. This was captured on video. College police and college administrators told this student, Robert Van Tunen, that he had to stop passing out the Constitution, and the only place where he would be allowed to pass out the Constitution was in the college's tiny designated free speech zone, and only after scheduling it and seeking approval several days or weeks ahead of time. Now, when I was a kid in college, which was admittedly quite a long time ago, colleges were supposed to be bastions of free and independent thought and exploration of new ideas. The First Amendment applied there as well as anywhere else, and apparently now 1 out of every 6 major colleges in the United States of America have designated free speech zones. And only when you're in that little designated area are you permitted to engage in free speech with your fellow students. And even then, there are restrictions. It's definitely time to start homeschooling our kids again. Absolutely here. Now, very bizarre stories. You're probably already aware, down in Guantanamo, they're having this kangaroo court to try and find some convictions of these accused terrorists who were captured, tortured, subject to rendition, and are being held in Guantanamo, even though the military court has already said that large numbers of them are innocent and should be released. The government won't release them. There's apparently something about their bodies that they don't want to get out. And that got hammered home here by this story over at RookNet, where a federal judge ruled last week that the United States government does not have to release images or videos of prisoners' interrogation at Guantanamo Bay, because the videos could be used for propaganda. Well, we don't need those images or videos anymore. The judge basically just told us there is something on those pictures and videos that is going to anger people. They've already admitted that, yes, they're kind of torturing these people. It's a little torture. It's not too bad. That's the only reason to try and keep these images and videos concealed, is they document the torture used to extract politically expedient confessions. Just like they're still hanging on to these people who've already been cleared for release, but their bodies carry the scars of things that were done to them far worse than waterboarding, and they don't want to take the chance that they'll release somebody and, like Binyam Mohammed, immediately go public and show the scars on his body. I guarantee you that you, the American people, still do not know the extent of the evils perpetrated by the United States government. Like the people of Germany in World War II, you won't find out how bad it was until it's all over. Going to grab a couple of phone calls here. Paul in Canada. Aloha, Paul. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Mike, how are you doing, buddy?
Doing great.
Good. Listen, man, I want to cover quite a few topics here with you.
Okay, we'll probably take you through the commercial break then.
Okay. And I want to get your feedback, too. So, let's start with a global government, okay?
Mm-hmm.
My opinion on that is that if you're going to have any kind of infrastructure that resembles a global government, it should be 188 nations sitting down with their representatives in a round table and deciding what goes on. And this would be a slow and arduous kind of implementation, but if you're going to have any kind of global government, it needs to have all of the distinct different opinions from around the world, and that's what it needs to be.
Well, first of all, let me halt you right there, because I'm adamantly opposed to a global government, because
so am I.
All governments tend toward oligarchy, and our own recent history here in the United States of America is that the more power gets concentrated in a single location, the more abusive and fascistic it tends to be. And right now, you know, a big part of this war agenda against the rest of the world is the U.S. trying to force the world into a global version of private central banking to permanently enslave the world to debt. And I think the best course for future humanity isn't globalism, but regionalism. We should have a planet with 1,000 small nations, each taking care of their own people and cooperating together to deal with larger issues. But the more things get centralized, you know, the larger the possibility of a single point failure that could be devastating to the entire world. And again, look at the globalization of economy as a good example, where the collapse of the mortgage-backed securities fraud in New York had repercussions all over Europe and Asia. Now, if we'd had firm economic borders matching our national borders, then the economic devastation would have been confined to the United States of America, and those other nations would not be in the trouble that they're in right now.
They wouldn't have suffered at all.
That's exactly right. And, you know, I think taking down national borders makes as little sense as propping open the fireproof doors in a building or blocking open the watertight bulkheads in a ship. Those barriers exist to preserve the whole structure in the event of a localized accident. Confine a fire...
Not only that, Mike, but they provide, like, 188 nations different perspectives on what we need to do. And
okay, we got to take a break for commercials. Hold that thought. We're going to come right back to it after these words from our sponsor. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And we're talking with Paul up in Canada about global government and why he and I both agree it is a very, very bad idea, because history has demonstrated the larger a government gets, the more evil it becomes, without exception. Paul, take it from here.
Yeah, we need a decentralized 188 nation kind of situation where each nation has their equal right and say in what goes on, so that we have a variety, many different opinions.
Well, that was the original intention of the United Nations General Assembly. How the UN got hijacked, of course, was with the creation of the Security Council, to whom actual authority to act was transferred. And it's dominated by its 5 permanent members, and everybody else sort of rotates in and out of it. But that was the original idea of the United Nations, and before that, the League of Nations. But when you get a nation that basically wants to break out and make a grab for the rest of the world, the first thing they do is start ignoring the United Nations. If they can't use it for political cover, like the U.S. is trying to do, then they'll simply say, we must act unilaterally, and they're off and running.
That's right, Mike. Yeah. So, like we all dream about these kind of, utopic kind of situations, but that's really what it needs to be.
Well, again, we can all
many different voices,
we can all dream up utopian systems of government, but the problem is that politics is always going to attract the very sort of people who shouldn't have that kind of power, and that was the reason when the United States was started. The designers of the Constitution deliberately gave all the power to the people and the states, and they literally put chains on that central government to keep it under control. And over the last 200 years, especially following the Civil War, the federal government broke free of its constitutional chains. These days, they don't even make a pretense of complying with the Constitution, and they're simply running completely out of control. So it all really comes down to the sort of person that's attracted to political power is going to be the worst problem with any new government that you form. Okay?
Together, yeah.
Okay.
And start to push those democratically elected officials, and they need to push them hard to realize that those constraints were there for a reason, and that they are not the rulers, they are the representatives of the people.
That's what I want to move.
Yeah, and I want to move on to a couple other points here, Mike.
Yep.
You got representative government in the United States. Well, it should be that way worldwide. It should be representative worldwide if they even want to even
well, that's the model. I mean, the idea of a republic is the government obeys the orders of the people. It doesn't issue them. But again, one of the ways that got hijacked in the United States, and I presume up in Canada, is this massive epidemic institutionalized vote fraud, election fraud, embodied in these electronic machines.
That's right, and that was one of my other points. Mike, you are a programmer, I am a programmer. We know how these vote machines can be manipulated to the point of changing the outcome of elections without the people having a clue, without them knowing what's going on. It's so easy with a little bit of code, and, you just delete, at the end, any kind of manipulation of the votes, and there's no trail, unless they have the code for the application that runs the voting machines. They cannot, the regular, everyday American person or Canadian person cannot surmise what's going on with the voting machines.
It's not just the code. I mean, the machines are not secure. And again, if you have not seen it, there's a documentary that's been on HBO called Hacking Democracy, where it features Bev Harris from blackboxvoting.org, where they just showed these voting machines literally have dozens of backdoors into them to change the outcome of an election. In the end of this documentary, Hacking Democracy, they actually rig an election on an unaltered machine just by using a doctored memory card. And what we need to do is go back to a system where the results of all elections are completely visible and publicly available all the way from the individual voting booth right up to the very top. And not have all this.
What does that mean, Mike? It means paper ballots.
It means paper ballots. It absolutely means paper ballots. And, every little voting precinct, they post their results publicly, probably on the web as well, so that everybody can follow all the way from the bottom all the way up to the top and make sure that the elections are honest. Because my philosophy is, if a government cannot prove the accuracy and honesty of the elections by which they claim authority over the people, then we, the people, are neither legally nor morally obligated to obey that government's dictates, to pay its bills, or certainly not to sacrifice the lives of our children in their wars of conquest. But over the last 20 years, we have seen the American election system completely taken over by a private company called Voters News Service, or whatever name they're calling themselves next year. And it's just the election process is completely withheld from the American people. There's no government oversight. There's no civilian oversight. People who want to go into the polls and witness the voting and the counting are literally being arrested and thrown out. And it's a completely clandestine system. You push the red button, and then the next day the TV tells you, this is who won, you will now obey them. And whatever they do to you that's bad, hey, it's what you wanted because you voted for them.
Exactly. And here's my thing, Mike, is that, you have a couple of parties down there. You got 3 or 4 or 5 other parties that are very small and kind of, either go red or blue, play Team Red or play Team Blue, which is a total nightmare anyway. Because
well, this nation was not set up that way. This nation was set up where anybody could have a political party. The reason we were forced onto the two-party system was to reduce the amount of money the corruptors would have to spend to bypass the will of the people in an election. Originally, if you had 5 political parties and 5 candidates, you had to bribe or give contributions to all 5 candidates in order to bypass the results of the election. That cost a lot of money, so they said, hey, we'll have the Republicans and the Democrats, and it creates the illusion of a choice, but we only have to bribe or campaign contribute to 2 people, and we'll save a lot of money that way.
Yeah, and here's the thing. There is no amount of money that is unredeemable to have a proper vote where you have paper ballots. All parties are involved in the edit, in the counting.
It's got to be completely open and transparent. The system is literally set up today to be completely riggable. And vote fraud, election fraud has a long history in this country, but ever since the Clinton administration, it's just gone completely out of control. And we have no idea who actually wins our elections. We only know who the TV networks tell us won. And that's how they kept Ron Paul out of the race. Even though Ron Paul had this amazing popular support in 2008 and 2012, they just absolutely said he is not going to get in the running because Israel doesn't want him, the Federal Reserve doesn't want him, and he will just not be allowed to play. Paul, we're coming up on a commercial break, and I'm going to have to let you go because we've got some other callers who've been waiting very, very patiently, and I want to get to them, as we head into the last half hour of the show. So, Paul, thank you very much. But, yeah, Blueprint for the New America, we take sledgehammers to those electronic voting machines, and we make election fraud grounds for immediate banning from public life forever. Because if a candidate cannot manage his own election staff, he's unfit, he or she is unfit to run the county, the state, the nation. We'll be back after these commercials. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phones here. Joe in Oklahoma. Aloha, Joe. Welcome to the show. Thank you for waiting all this time, and what's on your mind today?
You're welcome. Well, if you exclude all accidental shootings in the United States, is there a statistic showing whether or not the person who was shot, the victim, was armed? And if so, would that not show the great, the gun is the great equalizer, they say? An individual one-on-one, they say, hey, you got a gun, I got a gun, we're not going to shoot each other. But on the media, they keep going to groups. And to really put the nail in the coffin, you would have to go to the data showing whether or not, if a crime is committed, the person who the crime was committed against was armed. That will give you the real data.
That's a very good question, and I don't have that information. I do know that one of the main gun grabber arguments is to ban guns because of all the supposed accidental shootings where people injure themselves. But what they don't tell you is they're including in there intentional suicides.
Sure.
And if you ban the guns, obviously these people will find some other way to terminate, and shuffle off that mortal coil.
Well, that would be a great statistic to have. I haven't heard it yet, and that would really show whether or not it is the great equalizer. I understand you can't arm children in schools, so that would be left out of the conversation. But truly, go back to Wild West days, which I know was overblown and exaggerated, but that's what we need to find out.
When I was a kid, we took guns to school. Where I grew up, your 12th birthday, you get your first gun, and your lesson in gun safety. And because we lived in farming country, a lot of kids, and I'm one of them, we'd take our varminting rifle to school. We'd leave it in the cloakroom. Nobody got upset. Nobody got shot. And on the way home, we'd stop by the fields, and, we'd start plinking away at critters that were eating our food. And that was just, the way it was. It was no big deal.
Did you ever have to protect yourself against an intruder or
an
enemy of any type?
Yes, I did. Yes.
And your gun helped you do that?
Oh, absolutely.
I have not heard that. I listened to you for years, and I did
not
know that.
I don't like to talk about those things, but, when my wife and I were still living in Southern California, we had an intruder into our house, and I did not have to pull the trigger. I just put that laser dot on his forehead, and he left. And what's really interesting and revealing is I did call the police to report the intrusion, and they said, is the guy still saying, no, I chased him off, with a gun. They didn't even show up to take a report because they don't want to have police reports that say, law-abiding citizen thwarted crime with legally owned firearm.
Good point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate everything you do.
All right, and we're going to switch over to Gear in Florida. Aloha, Gear. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, yes. First time I ever called in, and I just wanted to compliment you. We're on the same page. I think the main point, there's so many things to talk about, and you hit some really good bullets here just in the last two calls. But what I wanted to concentrate on was why nothing happens with either party. They're both, everybody who studied it know that both parties are owned by the same group, which are the international bankers. And the thing that how they control it is every cabinet and every administration is filled with council on formulation members. So they're vetted, and both parties the bankers make sure that either party is going to have somebody that they can use for whatever rhetoric they're going to give you. So basically, I want to focus on the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderberg Group. And anybody who doesn't know about the Council on Foreign Relations should Google CFR, TC, Bilderberg, and do some studying, because that's why you can't move in the right direction, because both parties are filled with these people. So
yeah, and anybody who isn't going to go along with that agenda is just not allowed to play. And again, going back to 2008 and 2012, when Ron Paul had very obviously overwhelming popular support among GOP candidates, and yet was simply frauded and media manipulated, and he was simply ejected. He was just ejected.
Exactly.
You won't do what we want you to do, so therefore you're not allowed to play.
Darn straight. And like I say, they've got the billions now. They own the media, so nobody even gets fair play. That's why there are no other political parties. Mm-hmm. They've been financed out of the whole thing. And that's Ron Paul knew he couldn't do it under another party because the deck is stacked against you.
Well, he couldn't do it under any party. The deck was stacked against him. And while we're on the topic there, talking about the potential inevitable collapse of the U.S. banking system and the federal government, and we talk about the blueprint for the new America, I think Ron Paul would make a great first president for the new nation. Just I want to throw that out there for people to think about.
Totally with you. The only thing I don't agree with him on is they talk about having to have a gold-backed currency, and the fact is the bank's got most of the gold now, so there's got to be some sort of a compromise there because they've already got all our gold and silver.
Well,
in fact,
actually, the reality is they don't. They've been leasing it back out, and we don't know where it is.
Probably overseas.
But we need to lock our new currency to some commodity of tangible value, and I think it should be a unit of electricity. We've talked about this concept before, the electro, because whatever commodity you use as a monetary unit has to be available in abundant enough supply that it cannot be monopolized and hoarded and manipulated the way silver and gold can do. So, we've talked about the electro many times, about simply the electro is a kilowatt hour, and it can be tokenized so that you can walk around and buy and trade it, but that's what the unit of currency is dominated in, and this would not only stimulate more efficient electrical power production, storage, and transmission, it would be environmentally friendly. There's a lot of advantages to that, but we can't just have a private central bank with the authority to simply print up ink and paper with wild, reckless, and abandon. We can see right now that does not work.
U.S. Constitution, I think it's Article 1, Section 8 or 10, says Congress has the power to coin and regulate money. We should have U.S. notes without interest. We don't pay interest for the use of our own money because it's collateralized with our labor. That's the absurdity of it.
That's the way they set it up. And I would argue that because Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution vests the money creation authority with the U.S. government, it could only be transferred with a constitutional amendment. But, of course, the money junkies back in 1913, they'd had a little problem trying to get that 16th Amendment through.
3 years for the Federal Reserve Act on Jekyll Island, and we all know the story.
And so because they had because they had to resort to fraud on the 16th Amendment, they just said, we'll run it all, and Congress will pass the Federal Reserve Act. December 23rd, I think it was, on Christmas vacation. Woodrow Wilson signed it and wrote in his own diary afterwards, I've unwittingly destroyed my own nation. I would put it to you that the Federal Reserve System, because the money creation authority was not transferred to them by constitutional amendment, it is illegal and unconstitutional and has been all along. What we lack here is a Congress with the spine to stand up and say, we have to correct this past transgression against the American people.
So the key is waking up the people to the fact that both parties are bought and paid for by the international bankers, and they control both parties via being vetted by the Council on Foreign Relations. It was the Council on Foreign Relations was formed in around 1925, 23, somewhere in there, and basically it's been used ever since to fill our government with these people that are basically
the Council of Foreign Relations agenda is primarily U.S. foreign policy as it equates to wars of conquest. They were very much tied in with the Project for the New American Century. But again, all of these problems we are seeing in all these nations across the globe, Greece, United States, all across Europe, all comes back to having this Ponzi scheme private central bank in charge of the nation's economy. And there is no reason to have that arrangement other than that politicians can be bribed by the bankers to sell future generations into that slavery. That's really what it comes down to. We fought a revolution to be free of that kind of banking, only to be sold back into its slavery not once but 3 times by corrupted and corruptible politicians. And we absolutely cannot allow a similar system to take rise in whatever nation we form here in the aftermath of the coming collapse. Okay?
Yep, I fully agree with you.
All righty. We're going to let you go here because we're almost at a commercial break and we're almost out of the show here. I got a couple more things to talk about. Apparently, they are now back to pushing this idea that boys should be given the cervical cancer vaccine, the HPV vaccine, because, cancer can be caused by oral sex. And they're waving Michael Douglas around, even though he's now backed off and said he has no idea whether oral sex had anything to do with his throat cancer. But this is all about the money. If they're vaccinating the boys as well as the girls, double the doses, double the profits. That's what's driving all of this. We've just allowed money to completely dominate the thinking of our society to our detriment. We've got to take a break for commercials. We will be. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Kind of a weird story came out of SHTF plan. And the headline reads, government estimates pandemic would kill at least 2 million. Completely realistic and based on years of data. And the first thought that occurs to me, this is a replay of the 2009 when pigs fly flu scare to scare us all into running out and buying vaccines, most of which wound up being poured down the drain. And then I noticed that this report was issued not by the World Health Organization and not by the CDC, but the Department of Defense, who, to the best of my knowledge, does not have a charter to be looking at issues of the public health. And they make a specific point in there of saying that this pathogen that they're concerned about bears striking similarities to the Spanish flu. And you need to understand the Spanish flu was misnamed because it didn't come from Spain. It first surfaced in a U.S. military base inside the United States of America at the end of World War I, and from there it spread around the globe. It's almost like whoever was calling the shots there totaled up all the people who died in that trench warfare system, which almost seems intentionally designed to kill the maximum number of people while wrecking the least amount of real estate. And when Germany collapsed, somebody said, we didn't kill off enough, let's launch the Spanish flu. And we know that U.S. scientists with USAMRIID and CDC recovered the genome of the Spanish flu from frozen cadavers above the Arctic Circle, and they've been rebuilding it. And I think we're all very concerned with all this talk we're always hearing about overpopulation this and overpopulation that. If they can't kill off a bunch of humans in a war, stage a pandemic. Because remember, this government looks at us and treats us like we're livestock. Very clearly, from the way they're lying to us on a constant basis, they have no respect for us as human beings. No respect for us as citizens. They see us as chattel, as their property, to harvest wealth from, to breed soldiers and workers for them. And they do treat us like livestock. They tell us what foods we must eat, what foods we may not eat, what medications we must take, what medications we may not take, where we may go. They watch us constantly with cameras and NSA spying. Does that sound like a government that's respectful of its people, or does it sound like a giant human ranch? And the ranchers are out there saying, we got to keep the livestock under control. We don't want them stampeding out there. And everybody who's ever owned a farm or a ranch knows that there come times when you must cull the herd. We hear all this talk about the useless eaters from people like George Herbert Walker Bush. And we know by default we have a government and a banking establishment that have historically been willing to send hundreds of millions of human beings to horrible death and disfigurement to keep their little banking system going. And so in these evil times, the question is not, what is our government capable of? What is it not capable of? What would be too much for this government to try? And the answer is precious little. Fake a terror attack? Been there, done that. Lie us into wars? Done that several times. Lie to us about the economy? Done that as well. Now, looking at what we're seeing here in the corporate media, they're back to trying to resell war with Syria to the American people. And that's why it is very important for all of you to keep up the pressure on your members of Congress to say, no, we know you are lying. And if this nation goes to war, we will vote you out of office next election. And I'm sure Congress is going to duck the blame and say, well, Obama just did it all by himself. Well, I've read that Constitution. Congress can pull the plug on the White House anytime they want to. Obama has given them cause with his use of the IRS against political dissidents. That's an impeachable offense. And so you are perfectly justified in calling the House of Representatives and saying point blank, either you stop this war agenda or I will do whatever it takes to get you removed from office next election. Make it their job. force them to do their job and accept the responsibility of that office they hold. After the radio show today, I'm going to repost to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com all the contact information, the switchboard number for the Capitol Hill, the comment line for the White House. We've got to keep up the pressure because very obviously looking at the corporate media and John Kerry's press conference today, they're not quitting. They are not quitting. We're in a war of attrition against those who would lie us into wars of conquest, and the first side that quits loses. It is time for Americans to reassert their control over America because that is the way this country is supposed to work. That's why it says up at the very top of that Constitution, we the people. It's our nation. It belongs to us. The government are hired caretakers that we allow to manage the nation for our benefit, the benefit of the nation and its people. And it's time to remind them of that. Little statistic here, getting back to this whole war on terror, blah, blah, blah. Right now, because of the collapse of food safety in the United States of America, Americans are 110 times more likely to die from contaminated food than from terrorism. And because of the Gulf of Mexico disaster, because of Fukushima, because of fracking all across the center of the United States of America, because of GMOs, we are facing a food crisis in terms of having enough healthy, safe food for all the human beings on Earth to eat. Most of what we're being sold in our restaurants and our supermarkets are these concocted sort of food-like substances that will keep you alive and they hope not make you too sick, but if it does, hey, we've got a pill to sell you for that one. More concern coming out of Colorado about fracking fluids from all those wells. Now the number is up to 1,800 oil and gas wells in areas of northwest Colorado have been impacted by the flood, and they've had to be shut off. The extent of the damage isn't yet known, but local environmentalists have been posting photos of tipped-over oil tanks, flooded well sites, and broken pipelines. So this idea that we didn't need to worry about all this toxic industrial waste that was being pumped down into the ground to frack the rock down there and getting into the water supply for people, that's a moot point now. It is in the water supply. And not just coming out of the taps like it was shown in that documentary Gasland and Gasland Part 2. Colorado's definitely now off my list of places I would like to live. It's a boon for the bottled water companies. They're going to be making out like bandits on this whole deal here. The BRICS nations are starting to set up their own internet. They don't want to go through the U.S.-dominated internet infrastructure any longer. They're laying their own cables to have their own internet among their own nations that operates without going through the United States of America. This is part of the backlash against the NSA spying, which has royally ticked off pretty much the entire planet against the United States of America. Apparently there's a new Trojan that has been discovered, or a new technique that's been discovered to sabotage the cryptographic capabilities included in Intel's Ivy Bridge line of microprocessors. They were being billed as new ultra-secure form of standardized encryption, and now it's already been shown that it can be bypassed and backdoored. Last story that we're going to do today, we still see the corporate media, music corporations, TV corporations, film corporations going on about online piracy, but the reality is it's dropped significantly. Illegally downloaded tracks are plunging. 301 million music tracks tracked in Great Britain last year to 199 million in the latest measurement. A third of music piracy disappeared in the last year, and that's good. But music sales fell during the same time, which undermines the whole idea that music piracy was the reason for the decline in profitability of the music industry. And as I pointed out many, many times before, the problem with our current media industries is they just do the same thing over and over and over again. They want to sell you today what was popular last week, which was sold because it was popular the month before. And it's all very bland and sounds the same, and that's the real reason, along with the crashing economy, why sales are down. The pirates, they're wrong, but the pirates were being unfairly scapegoated. There's our music. We got to head on out of here. Please take a moment to go over to republicbroadcasting.org. Hit that little donate button. We need your help to stay on the air. Republic Trading Group for your physical silver and gold. Talk to you tomorrow, Friday. Aloha, America.